Hello, everyone. I hope you're well, and it's nice to be back speaking with you from my recent book, Confronting Old Testament Controversies. And as I explained in the session last week, I cover 4 controversial areas in relationship to the Old Testament: evolution, violence, history, and sexuality. And last week I addressed the issue of divine violence because many people, including evangelical Christians, are today asking, can God really be so violent? Isn't God good? And so I addressed that issue. And today I'm addressing the issue of history in relationship to the Old Testament. But of course, we'll see, and I'll make a couple comments about the importance of history for the New Testament as well. But the controversies come up in regard to questions like, and this is where our focus will be, did the Exodus from Egypt actually happen? And does it matter whether it actually happened? In other words, if there was really nothing like the Exodus that happened in space and time, couldn't it still be theologically important as a story that is communicating that God helps people, can help people when they're in trouble? God can help people when they're even beyond human help. And indeed, the Exodus, which is the story of the deliverance from Egyptian bondage, is a good illustration of that, particularly when we think of the Israelites having left Egypt, now pursued by an angry and embarrassed Pharaoh who confronts them when Israel has their back against a sea, the Reed Sea or Red Sea. But God opens up the sea so that the Israelites can escape, but then punishes the Egyptians by closing the waters on them. Is it really necessary that that happens in order for the Exodus story to have a theological significance for us? Maybe the story is more like a fiction, and fiction has its own kind of truth. And the truth that some people see there is that, as I say, that it shows God who is able to save his people even in the most difficult circumstances. So, so we're going to address that question. And when I'm addressing this question, it reminds me of a story when I was young and I wasn't yet a Christian. I didn't become a Christian till just before college, the summer before college. And this is when I was 13 or 14 years old. And I was going to a church, not an evangelical church, but a more liberal church. And as 13, 14-year-olds do in some churches, they take what's called a communicant class in order to become a member of the church. And as one of the last steps, you have an interview by one of the ministers. And I went in to see the minister. And the minister asked, do you have any questions for me before you become a member of the church? And I said, well, and I don't know, I was kind of a shy person. I'm not sure where this was coming from. But I said to him, you know, I'm having a hard time believing that what I'm reading in the Bible or what you're telling me is in the Bible actually happened or not. And that was including the story of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. And the minister looked at me without blinking an eye and said, well, we do too. Don't let that be an obstacle to you joining the church. Now, this church was a very, in retrospect, I didn't know it at the time, was a very liberal church, but it kind of illustrates how some Christians don't think the historical nature of our faith, of the Bible story, is very important. But I wrote this chapter because some evangelical Protestant scholars are making the argument that events like the Exodus and the conquest never happened, and that it doesn't matter that they did not happen. They're still good stories that tell us about the nature of God. In this talk, I'm going to focus in on the Exodus. So again, the Exodus is a story about how our God can save people when they're beyond helping or saving themselves. It's the story of an enslaved people whom God frees from their bondage to an oppressive superpower. Now, why do some Christian scholars, and here I'm thinking just to give you a couple names, and they've talked about it publicly, and they're friends of mine whom I think are fine Christians, but I disagree with them on this. But to give you some names, Peter Enns and Brad Kelly and Kent Sparks, and there are others as well, but they're the ones who have written recently in this way. Why do they come to that conclusion? Why do they say the Exodus never happened? Well, and in this they are right. There is no direct evidence of the Exodus ever happening. By which I mean there's like no Egyptian source that mentions the Israelites when they were in the land of Egypt. And also, since the conquest happened right after the Exodus, they say that there's a lack of evidence in the archaeological record, for instance, of the conquest happening. For instance, the archaeological tell associated with the city of Jericho, Tel es Sultan, according to archaeological excavations that took place in the late 1950s, early 1960s by Kathleen Kenyon, and that was the last major archaeological investigation of that site. She concluded that there was no evidence of Jericho even being an inhabited city during the time, and in this case, she's speaking primarily of a 15th century Exodus. I'll come back to this issue of the timing of the Exodus. There is no evidence that the city of Jericho is even occupied at this time. Before that, yes, as a matter of fact, Jericho is one of the oldest cities that is on record. And afterwards, of course, we even read stories in the New Testament about that take place in the city of Jericho. But according to Kenyon, there was no evidence for Jericho being occupied during the late Bronze Age. And as I say, first of all, these questions raise an interesting question that we can't resolve dogmatically. We might ask, when does the Bible place the Exodus? When does the Bible place the Exodus? Now, as you read the Bible, first of all, the interesting thing is, within the Exodus story itself, there aren't a lot of concrete sort of historical markers. For instance, the Egyptian king is referred to throughout as Pharaoh or the Pharaoh, not given a name. And so, unfortunately, it doesn't say, Ramesses or Tutmosis or whomever. So the text that is most informative on this question is 1 Kings 6:1, which says that Solomon began to build the temple in the 480 years after the Exodus. So 480 years after the Exodus. So as you look at that, if you can compute when Solomon's fourth year was and add 480 to it, you might think then that you could arrive at the date of the Exodus, or at least the century of the Exodus event. And indeed, we won't go into all the details, so we can arrive at a pretty good recognition of when Solomon's fourth year was. Again, it's to make the long story short, even though you get a lot of relative dating in the Bible, that this happened 4 years after that, and that kind of thing. Scholars who specialize in this are able to be pretty certain about dates in the first millennium BC, thanks to correlations within the Bible, then correlations with other ancient Near Eastern chronological texts, and in a couple places, those texts mention eclipses of the sun, which of course modern astronomers can determine when that takes place. Long story short, the fourth year of Solomon is approximately 966 BC. So on the one hand, it might seem as easy as taking 966 BC, adding 480 years to that, and ending up with a date in the 15th century BC. And that's kind of the traditional date for it. But because the archaeology doesn't work well, many scholars will reconsider that date and say that 480 is suspiciously a round number. It's also interesting that it's divisible by 40, which is taken as a symbolic number for a generation. A symbolic number, but not an actual number, the argument goes. The actual number might be more like 25, that people start having children in their mid-20s. And if you take 12 generations, multiply it by 25, you get 300 years. You add that to 966 BC, and you end up with a date in the 13th century BC. And so you have Bible-believing Christians and scholars, some of whom will argue for 15th century, more will argue for 13th century. And if you go for a 13th century Exodus, certain archaeological conclusions, like concerning Jericho, do make more sense, because it seems that Jericho was revived in the early Iron Age, which is in the 13th century, but there's still archaeological problems. So, but bottom line is, more skeptical scholars, skeptical about the actual historical veracity of the Exodus account, whether 15th or 13th century, point out that you don't have direct evidence of or a reference to the Israelites in Egypt, and not all the archaeological data line up with either a 15th century or a 13th century Exodus. So what are we to make of this? The first thing that I would say is that before we even address the question of did it happen or not, we need to ask the question of, does it matter whether it happened or not? And I want to suggest, over against my friends Sparks, Enns, and Kelly, and others, that if the Exodus didn't happen, then the Exodus has no theological value. Remember that they said, it doesn't matter whether it happened, it's still a good story that tells us about the nature of God. But you see, the reason why I conclude otherwise is because I would say that the story of the Exodus is establishing what I would call a track record for God. In other words, I mean that later Israelites, and even us today, look back on the Exodus and indeed are encouraged in the midst of our present troubles. We're encouraged not by a good story, but because we're getting an account of something God had actually done. He did this in the past, and therefore he might choose to do it in my life. Now that seems to be the way that the psalmist is reasoning in Psalm 77. So you might want to turn with me to Psalm 77, and I'll read through it with some commentary here. So Psalm 77 begins, "In good lament fashion, I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night, I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted." Okay, so here the psalmist is deeply distressed. Some problem in his life has so upset him that he can't sleep at night. Now notice he remembers God, but his first remembrance of God is not helpful to him. He says, "I remembered you, God, and I groaned. I meditated and my spirit grew faint. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart meditated and my spirit asked." And now notice in verses 7 to 9, the psalmist is going to ask God a lot of challenging questions. He says, will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? And this is really hard-hitting criticism of God. It's basically saying, God, you made promises to me, and it looks to me from my life that you were deceiving me because you're not following through. Now, like many laments, the psalmist does not end up just accusing God. Notice in verses 13 to 15, he says, your ways, God, are holy. What God is as great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. Now, a lot of laments make that transition from complaint to praise or confidence without explanation. But that's not true of Psalm 77, which is one of the reasons it's one of my favorite Psalms. Notice in verse 11 and 12, it says, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. In other words, the psalmist, in the midst of his present trouble, is looking to the past. And as he looks to the past and he sees God's mighty acts, it gives him confidence to live in that troubled present and hope for the future. Now, the connection with the Exodus is it's one of those mighty deeds. And indeed, the psalmist ends in verse 16 and following by referencing the crossing of the sea. It says, the waters saw you, God. The waters saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water. The heavens resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters. Though your footprints were not seen, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. In other words, the psalmist takes great comfort and derives hope from looking back at the Exodus. God, you did this. You saved my people when there was no chance that they could save themselves. And Lord, you might do that in my life today. Okay, so I can't agree with those who say it doesn't matter whether the Exodus happened or not. But what about this issue that there's no direct evidence of the Exodus? What can we say about that? Why isn't there? Well, the first thing I would say is there is direct evidence. We do have a record of the Exodus story, and that direct evidence is the Bible itself. And in a book of the history of Israel that I wrote with two other scholars, Ian Proven and M.Phil Long, called A Biblical History of Israel, we point out in the front part why it's wrong to be so deeply suspicious of the Bible that we don't treat it as a kind of historical source, like we do other ancient records. But why is there no Egyptian direct evidence? If you look back at what we do have from ancient Egypt, and remember, we don't have a full record of their history from their own documents. But one thing you can say is what we do have, they don't tend to record their defeats, particularly since a lot of the information we get about Egypt are writings on monuments like pyramid walls or inside the chambers and pyramids or on obelisks or other things like that. That's not a place where you would record your defeats. Now, one of my friends has written, he goes, no, they have recorded their defeats. Remember in the 16th century, Egypt was taken over, or at least northern Egypt was taken over by a group of Semites called the Hyksos. And we learn about that from their records. And my response to that is, yes, we do, because remember, we learn about it because they're celebrating the fact that they ultimately kicked them out and defeated them. And there is no happy ending for the Egyptians to the story of the Exodus. Now you might ask, well, why don't they mention the name of the Egyptian pharaoh either? And another friend of mine, Jim Hoffmeyer, in an excellent book, I think the title is Israel in Egypt. He's an Egyptologist as well as a biblical scholar. He points out that the Egyptians themselves never record the name of their enemy leaders. And that's kind of a way of sort of suppressing their memory for the future. And so he suggests that what we see in the book of Exodus is a kind of Egyptian strategy of suppressing the name of the pharaoh. Now, while there's not direct evidence, I would suggest there's a lot of indirect evidence. And I'll just mention a few, and in my book, I talk about them at more length. But we do have, for instance, a stele, S-T-E-L-E, which is an unformed monument, kind of a big, I think it's diorite slab, on which Pharaoh Merneptah, the son of Ramesses, records victories that he achieved during a raiding attack in Canaan. And we could date this to 1208 BC, end of the 13th century, as I say, right after his father Ramesses. And in there, after talking about other groups that he defeated, he goes, Israel was laid waste, his seed is no more. So this is the first mention of Israel outside the Bible. Of course, it also smacks of the kind of battle hyperbole that we see throughout ancient Near Eastern battle reports. His seed is no more. And fits very nicely in the broader context for the idea that Israel in the land during the period that we know of as the period of Judges, where they hadn't taken all the promised land yet and wouldn't for quite some time. So by the end of the 13th century, most historians would say by that time, Israel is in the land. Also, in the 13th century, we have an interesting phenomenon that's going on that has been attested archaeologically. If you study during the 13th century, large Canaanite cities on the coast of the Mediterranean begin to crumble, while at the same time, a number of small villages are cropping up in the highlands, in the central part of Judea and what later is known as Samaria. And what's interesting, people point out, is besides seeing these villages as all having, say, the same kind of technology of olive tree terracing and plaster-lined cisterns, there's a notable absence of pig bones, which, of course, as you know, Israelites didn't eat pig. It was considered an unclean food. And this is happening in the 13th century. We might also suggest the Amarna Letters. The Amarna Letters are a whole bunch of letters that come from the 14th century, but they are letters that are talking where these Canaanite kings of various cities like Jerusalem, Jericho, Shechem, etc., Gezer, are writing to the Pharaoh, who is their sovereign overlord. They're in covenant treaty relationship with them. And one of the topics of concern is the appearance of the Habiru, Now, when they were first read in the late 19th century, everybody thought that was a direct reference to the Hebrews and to the conquest. That's not the case. We now know a lot more. We know that Habiru is not an ethnic designation, but rather a social designation. It means landless people who are threatening civilization. Now, while it's true that you can't take it as an ethnic designation, if you were a Canaanite king, the Israelites would appear as Habiru for you. Okay, so that and other things give us indirect evidence in favor of the Exodus. And maybe one more comment about this, a comment about the fact that we don't have extra biblical direct evidence to the Exodus. In conversation with one of my friends who holds this view, I said, you know what, I know you believe in the historical nature of the resurrection of Christ. He goes, yes, I absolutely do. That's very important for our faith. And I said, but you also realize there's no direct evidence of the resurrection either. And his response to me was, except for the New Testament, And his response to me was interesting. He goes, well, how could we explain what happens after the resurrection? The dramatic growth of the church, the people who were willing to die for their faith. That certainly is powerful evidence supporting the idea of the resurrection. And I said, I couldn't agree more. But now think about the Exodus. Isn't the same true there? Didn't later Israelites look back on the Exodus event as their formative experience that led to their sense of being God's chosen nation? So I think there is a parallel there. Bottom line, as Christians reading the Bible, I believe we have every reason to think that the Exodus, and indeed the conquest and the other events in the Old Testament that were reported as historical, happened. Now, just briefly and suggestively, and if you want more, you could either read that Biblical History of Israel, or you can read the Controversies book, or you can read the How to Read Exodus. I think there's room for reading scripture more closely and asking questions like, is the Bible really saying it was 2 million people, or 600,000 plus men, which would mean a group of about 2 million people traveling up to the promised land. I mean, there are significant questions to ask about those kind of features in the text, but I'm not going to go into the detail here. But it's really important, I think, to think of the Exodus as an actual historical event, because, as I've already said a number of times, its theological value to us is dependent on it actually having happened. And another way that I think we should appreciate its importance is because the Exodus also is kind of a prefiguring of Christ. And I'm going to end with this, because if you haven't thought about it, I really hope you go back and read the gospel story with the Exodus and wilderness wandering story in your mind, because Jesus is the ultimate Exodus. Jesus begins his ministry by being baptized by John the Baptist. Now, I want you to think of that as Jesus's crossing of the sea. For one reason is that it's immediately followed by 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, where Jesus experiences temptations. 3 temptations that we'll see are the temptations that the Israelites experienced in the wilderness. Also, because 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 4, I think it is, talks about how the crossing of the sea was a form of baptism for the people at the time of Moses. But now back to the temptations. Jesus experiences 3 temptations. They're the same temptations that Israel experienced in the wilderness. The first temptation is concerning hunger. You know, Jesus has been fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. The Israelites were hungry in the wilderness and they complained, but not Jesus. When the devil says, turn these stones into bread, Jesus says, man does not live by bread alone. He's quoting the book of Deuteronomy, which, by the way, is Moses's final sermon to the second generation of Israelites who are going into the promised land, and saying, don't be like your forefathers who were disobedient in the wilderness and thus died in the wilderness. Second temptation is take yourself up to the highest point of the city, the temple, and throw yourself down. Jesus immediately recognizes that as a temptation to test God, which he resists. Do not test the Lord your God. Again, the Israelites tested God in the wilderness, but Jesus quotes the book of Deuteronomy to say, I will be the obedient son of God, in contrast to the disobedient sons of God. Then finally, bend the knee and worship me, Satan says, and I will give you all the kingdoms of the world. The Israelites bent the knee to the golden calf. Jesus resists that temptation, and he says, you must worship the Lord and him alone. A third time, quoting the book of Deuteronomy. Jesus is the obedient Son of God, in contrast to the disobedient sons of God. And then, it continues. And we could point out a lot of other connections, including in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus, after choosing 12 disciples, reflecting the 12 tribes of Israel, he then goes on a mountain to preach a sermon. We call it the Sermon on the Mount. And he talks about the law, and a Jew reading that, and even a Christian who knows their Old Testament reading that, can't miss the fact that Jesus is acting like God giving the law on Mount Sinai. Finally, we come to the crucifixion itself, which takes place on the occasion of the Passover, on the eve of the Passover. And Paul in 2 Corinthians 5 proclaims Jesus is our Passover lamb. And of course, Passover is the annual celebration of the deliverance from Egypt, the Exodus. So again, the Exodus is an important part of the redemptive history of God. Our God is a God who enters into space and time in order to save us. So I hope you consider the importance of both the history of the Exodus as well as its theological message. And look forward to talking again with you.